For years, people believed dimples were one of the simplest genetic traits in the human body. Parents told their kids that dimples were a lucky gene. Teachers used dimples as a textbook example of dominant inheritance. Even old biology books listed dimples right next to attached earlobes and widow's peaks as proof of simple, single-gene traits you either had or didn't have. But when researchers finally sat down and studied the actual biology behind dimples, using muscle scans, family trees, twin studies, and genetic sequencing, almost everything we believed turned out to be wrong. What they found didn't just correct a small mistake in an old textbook. It completely changed how scientists explain one of the most charming facial features in the world. If you've ever wondered why your dimples show up only when you smile, why one cheek dimples but not the other, or why two dimpled parents can have a child with no dimples at all, the answer is far stranger than genetics ever explained. If you're enjoying content like this, hit subscribe, because every week I break down surprising science stories most people have never heard the real explanation for. Now let's get into what dimples actually are and why scientists spent so long getting the story wrong. For more than a century, dimples were treated as a textbook case of Mendelian inheritance, the same simple pattern used to explain traits like eye color in early biology classes. The idea was that a single dominant gene controlled whether or not a person had dimples, and if even one parent carried that gene, their child had a strong chance of having them too. This explanation was neat, easy to teach, and easy to remember, which is exactly why it spread through classrooms for generations. It made its way into science fair posters, family trees drawn on chalkboards, and even casual conversation, where people would say things like, dimples are dominant, so if one parent has them, the kid probably will too. There was just one problem. It was never actually proven. No scientist ever isolated a single dimple gene. No study ever mapped it to one specific spot on the human genome. The idea was based on observation and guesswork, not hard genetic evidence. It looked like it made sense because dimples do tend to run in families. But running in families is not the same thing as being controlled by one simple gene. Plenty of traits run in families without being caused by a single switch. Height runs in families. Handwriting style can run in families. That doesn't mean either one comes from one gene turning on or off. When researchers finally began studying dimples using modern tools, family pedigree tracking, muscle imaging, and DNA analysis, the pattern fell apart almost immediately. Families showed inheritance patterns that a single dominant gene could never produce. Two parents without dimples sometimes had children with clear, deep dimples. Two parents with matching dimples sometimes had children with none at all. Identical twins, who share nearly identical DNA, were sometimes found with different dimple patterns. One twin with a visible dimple on one cheek, the other with none, or with dimples on both cheeks instead of one. This last discovery was the one that really caught researchers off guard. Identical twins come from a single fertilized egg that splits into two, meaning their DNA is close to a perfect match. If a trait is controlled by one dominant gene, identical twins should almost always match on that trait. But dimple studies on twins kept showing mismatches, cases where one twin clearly had dimples and the other didn't, or where the dimples appeared on different sides of the face between the two siblings. That kind of mismatch simply doesn't happen with true single-gene dominant traits. It was one of the strongest clues that something else had to be going on. If dimples were really controlled by one dominant gene, none of this should happen. Identical twins should match almost perfectly. Two dimpled parents should reliably pass the trait along. But that isn't what the data showed. The old model didn't just have gaps. It was fundamentally the wrong explanation. So scientists went back to basics and asked a different question. Instead of only studying DNA, they studied the actual anatomy of a dimple. What is physically happening under the skin when someone smiles and a small crease appears on their cheek? The answer turned out to be far more interesting than a single gene switching on or off. A dimple isn't a spot, a dot, or a special marking on the skin. It's the visible result of a small variation in a facial muscle called the Zygomaticus major. This muscle runs from the cheekbone down to the corner of the mouth, and it's the main muscle responsible for pulling your lips upward when you smile. In most people, this muscle exists as one continuous, unbroken band of tissue. But in people with dimples, researchers found something different. The muscle is either split into two separate bands, or it has an extra branch that connects directly to the skin instead of only to deeper facial tissue. When this person smiles, the muscle contracts and pulls the skin inward at that exact connection point, creating the small crease we call a dimple. Researchers who studied this using detailed facial dissections and imaging noted that the exact shape of this muscle variation isn't identical from person to person either. In some people, the extra branch is thin and only creates a faint crease. In others, it's thicker and pulls harder on the skin, producing a deep, very visible dimple even during a small smile. This helps explain why dimples themselves vary so much in depth and shape from one person to the next, something a simple on or off gene could never account for. A trait controlled by a single dominant gene tends to look roughly the same in everyone who has it. Dimples, by contrast, come in an almost endless range of shapes, sizes, and depths, which is exactly what you'd expect from a trait shaped by muscle structure, rather than a genetic switch. In other words, a dimple isn't something extra sitting on top of the skin. It's the physical sign of a muscle that developed with a slightly different structure than usual. The skin above that structural variation gets pulled tighter when the muscle moves, which is exactly why dimples usually disappear when the face is relaxed, and only show up when someone smiles. This single discovery explained almost every strange pattern researchers had been puzzling over. Because the trait depends on the exact shape and branching of a muscle, and muscle development is influenced by many small genetic and biological factors working together. Not one dominant switch, dimples don't follow a simple, predictable inheritance pattern. They follow a complex, layered one, shaped by dozens of tiny genetic influences interacting with each other during early development in the womb. This also explains why dimples are so often uneven. Muscle development on the left side of the face and the right side of the face isn't perfectly mirrored during fetal growth. Small variations can occur on one side without occurring on the other. That's why so many people have a dimple only on their left cheek, or only on their right, instead of a perfectly matched pair. It isn't random bad luck. It's the natural result of two sides of the face developing independently, each with their own small chance of forming that muscle variation. This idea that the left and right sides of the body don't develop in perfect lockstep isn't unique to dimples either. Scientists see the same kind of small left-right variation in fingerprints, freckle patterns, and even the exact curve of someone's smile. The human body is symmetrical in a general sense, but at the microscopic level of muscle fibers and connective tissue, no face is ever built with perfect mirror precision. Dimples are just one of the more visible examples of that natural asymmetry. Once researchers understood dimples as a structural muscle trait rather than a simple genetic switch, they started asking a bigger question. If it isn't one dominant gene, how many genes are actually involved? The answer, based on genome studies comparing thousands of people with and without dimples, is that dimples are what scientists call a polygenic trait. That means many different genes, each contributing a small effect, combine together to influence whether the Zygomaticus major muscle develops with that extra branch or split. No single gene guarantees a dimple. No single gene rules one out. It's the combined result of multiple genetic variants working together, plus random developmental factors that occur as a baby's facial muscles are forming before birth. This is actually a pattern scientists see again and again when they study traits that were once taught as simple textbook examples. Height, for years, was oversimplified in basic biology classes. So was eye color, so was skin tone. Almost every time researchers use modern genetic tools to dig deeper into a trait that seems simple on the surface, they discover the same thing. Real biology is almost always more complicated than the simplified version we were taught in school. Dimples turned out to be a perfect example of this pattern. What looked like a straightforward switch-like trait was actually the product of a delicate multi-gene developmental process, layered with a fair amount of randomness in how facial muscles form in the womb. Researchers also point out that this kind of complexity is actually the rule in human biology, not the exception. Traits controlled by a single gene, like certain rare blood disorders, are actually fairly uncommon. Most of the physical features that make up a human face, including the shape of the nose, the fullness of the lips, and the structure of the jaw, come from dozens or even hundreds of genes working together in combination. Dimples simply got mistaken for a simple trait for a very long time because the pattern of sometimes it shows up in families looked, on the surface, like something a single dominant gene would produce. The muscle structure underneath doesn't necessarily change. What changes is how the skin responds to it. Interestingly, researchers also found that weight and cheek fullness play a real role here too. People with more fat tissue in their cheeks often show more pronounced dimples because the muscle pulls against a fuller, softer layer of skin and tissue, creating a deeper visible crease. This is part of why baby cheeks so often show dramatic dimples that soften or disappear as the child grows and the face becomes leaner. The same logic explains why some adults notice a dimple appearing for the first time later in life, often after gaining a small amount of weight in the face or completely disappearing after significant weight loss. The underlying muscle variation was likely there the entire time. It simply wasn't visible until the surrounding tissue changed enough to reveal it, or it stopped being visible once the tissue changed in the opposite direction. This is a good example of how a genetic trait and its visible expression are not always the same thing. The muscle structure is fixed early in development, but how obvious it looks on the outside can shift throughout a person's life depending on completely unrelated factors like body fat, aging, and skin elasticity. While cheek dimples come from a muscle variation, researchers found that chin dimples are something else entirely, and mixing the two up is one of the most common misunderstandings people have. A chin dimple isn't caused by a muscle at all. It comes from the underlying bone structure of the jaw. During fetal development, the two halves of the lower jawbone grow separately and are supposed to fuse together into one smooth, connected bone before birth. In most people, this fusion is complete and seamless, leaving no visible mark. But in some people, the fusion isn't perfectly smooth. A small gap or indentation remains where the two bone halves joined. The skin and soft tissue above it follow that same shape, creating the visible line or crease we recognize as a chin dimple, sometimes also called a cleft chin. Because this trait comes from a bone structure rather than a muscle, it follows a completely different developmental pathway than cheek dimples, controlled by an entirely different set of genes and processes. This is exactly why some people have chin dimples but no cheek dimples, some have cheek dimples but no chin dimple, and some have both, each combination determined independently in the womb. Some researchers studying jaw development have also noted that chin dimples can vary quite a bit in how they present. Some people have a small, subtle dent that's only visible up close. Others have a deep, clearly defined vertical line running down the middle of the chin. This range, again, points toward a trait shaped by small variations in bone fusion rather than a single genetic switch producing the exact same result in every person who carries it. Once scientists confirmed that both cheek dimples and chin dimples were structural traits rather than simple genetic switches, they turned to a bigger question that goes beyond individual biology. Why does this trait exist at all? Does it serve any evolutionary purpose? Or is it just a harmless side effect of how facial muscles and bones happen to develop? This is where the research gets especially interesting. Unlike traits such as skin tone or lactose tolerance, which clearly helped early humans survive specific environmental pressures, dimples don't appear to provide any survival advantage at all. They don't affect strength, disease resistance, reproduction, or physical performance. A person with dimples and a person without them face identical biological odds when it comes to survival and health. So why does the trait persist across human populations instead of disappearing? Researchers believe the most likely explanation lies in something called sexual selection rather than natural selection. Natural selection favors traits that help an organism survive and reproduce successfully against environmental challenges. Sexual selection, on the other hand, favors traits that simply make an individual more attractive to potential partners, even if the trait provides no survival benefit whatsoever. Across human cultures and throughout history, dimples have consistently been viewed as an attractive, charming, youthful facial feature. Studies on facial attractiveness repeatedly show that people rate smiling faces with dimples as warmer, friendlier, and more approachable compared to identical smiling faces without them. If a trait consistently makes someone appear more likable or more attractive to potential partners, even slightly, it can persist and spread through a population over many generations, purely through mate preference, without ever needing to provide any physical survival advantage at all. This is the same evolutionary mechanism believed to be behind several other harmless human traits that show up across populations for no clear survival reason. It isn't that dimples were selected for the way malaria resistance or high-altitude adaptation were. It's that, generation after generation, people found the trait appealing, and appealing traits tend to stick around. It's worth pointing out how differently sexual selection works compared to natural selection when you actually picture it. Natural selection is about survival. A trait either helps you live long enough to reproduce, or it doesn't. Sexual selection is about preference. A trait simply has to be liked by potential partners, often enough for it to keep getting passed down. Peacock tails are the classic example of this in the animal kingdom. A huge, colorful tail that offers zero survival benefit and arguably makes the bird more visible to predators. Yet it persists because peahens consistently prefer mates who have one. Human dimples are believed to work through a milder version of the exact same evolutionary logic, a small facial feature that offers no physical advantage but tends to be found appealing. And appealing traits have their own quiet way of sticking around across generations. Historical and cultural evidence backs this up in an interesting way too. Long before anyone understood genetics, different cultures across the world independently developed their own folklore around dimples, almost always positive. In parts of East Asia, dimples were historically associated with good fortune and a pleasant temperament. In parts of Europe, old folk sayings claimed dimples were the mark of an angel's touch on a baby's cheek. In several African and South Asian cultural traditions, dimples were seen as a sign of charm and were sometimes considered especially attractive in a potential spouse. None of these cultures had any concept of muscle structure or polygenic inheritance, yet they all arrived at the same general conclusion. Dimples were seen as something desirable. That kind of independent, repeated cultural preference across unrelated civilizations lines up closely with what researchers now believe drove the trait's persistence biologically. Researchers also studied how common dimples actually are across different populations. and the numbers turned out to be far less consistent than most people assume. Estimates suggest that roughly 20 to 30% of people worldwide have visible cheek dimples, though this number varies noticeably between different regions and ethnic groups. Because the trait depends on dozens of small genetic contributions working together, and those specific genetic combinations aren't evenly distributed across every population on Earth, dimple frequency naturally differs from place to place, the same way many other polygenic traits do. What researchers did not find was any meaningful pattern connecting dimple frequency to race in the outdated, oversimplified sense many people still imagine. Populations that share almost no historical or geographic connection can show remarkably similar rates of dimples, while populations that are geographically close to each other can show very different rates. This lines up with everything scientists already know about polygenic traits in general. Because so many small genetic factors combine somewhat randomly during development, the trait doesn't cluster neatly along old racial or ethnic lines the way people once assumed simple traits like this would. Perhaps the most surprising finding of all came when researchers looked at what dimples are not connected to. Because dimples were taught for so long as a simple dominant genetic trait, some people assumed they might be linked to other physical characteristics, or even personality traits, the same way folklore has long claimed dimples are a sign of good luck, charm, or a happy nature. Genetic studies found absolutely no biological connection between having dimples and any personality trait, intelligence measure, or health outcome. The muscle and bone variations responsible for dimples exist in a completely separate part of facial development, unrelated to brain development, temperament, or any internal biological system. In other words, the old folklore claiming dimpled people are naturally luckier or more cheerful isn't rooted in any biological reality. Any connection between dimples and personality exists only in cultural belief and social perception, not in genetics. If people do treat someone with dimples differently, warmer, friendlier, more approachable, it isn't because their DNA is doing anything different beneath the surface. It's because of how humans have been culturally trained to respond to that particular facial feature when someone smiles. This connects to a well-documented effect, in psychology sometimes called the halo effect, where people unconsciously assume that someone with one positive trait, like an attractive smile, must also have other positive traits, like a kind personality or high intelligence, even though there's no actual link between the two. Dimples appear to trigger this exact effect in a lot of people. Someone sees a dimpled smile, reads it as warm and friendly, and then unconsciously extends that same warmth to how they judge the person's character, even before knowing anything else about them. It's a purely social and psychological reaction, not a biological one, but it's a big part of why dimples carry such a strong positive reputation across so many different cultures. Scientists studying facial features have also compared dimples to a handful of other structural facial traits that were once assumed to be simple dominant or recessive genes, and found the same story repeating itself almost every time. Cleft chins, the shape of an earlobe, the presence of a widow's peak, even the ability to fold your tongue, traits that used to appear in the exact same simple genetics lessons dimples did, have all been re-examined with modern tools and shown to be either far more genetically complex than originally believed, or in some cases not reliably genetic at all. This pattern has led many researchers to argue that the whole category of simple dominant traits taught in old biology classes needs a serious update, since almost none of the classic examples have held up well under closer genetic scrutiny. These are caused by a completely different mechanism than facial dimples. They form where a short ligament connects the skin directly to the pelvic bone, pulling the skin inward slightly at that exact point. Because this is a completely different structure, involving a ligament and bone rather than a facial muscle, it develops through its own separate genetic and anatomical pathway, unrelated to cheek or chin dimples. A person can have all three types, some of them, or none at all, in any combination, because each one is decided independently during early development. Some people also notice a small dimple appear on the outer knee or elbow when the joint bends. These usually come from the way skin folds and stretches over the joint rather than from any distinct muscle or bone variation, and they tend to be far less consistent from person to person than cheek, chin, or lower back dimples. Researchers see these more as a byproduct of ordinary joint movement and individual skin thickness than as a defined inherited trait in the same category as the others. Looking back at how long it took science to properly explain something as small and ordinary as a dimple also says a lot about how research actually progresses. For most of the 20th century, there was simply no practical way to study muscle structure in living people without invasive surgery, so scientists relied on family observation and guesswork, which is exactly how the flawed single-gene explanation took hold in the first place, and then sat unchallenged in textbooks for decades. It wasn't until non-invasive imaging technology and large-scale genetic sequencing became widely available that researchers could finally look directly at the muscle tissue itself and compare genetic data across thousands of people at once. Once those tools existed, the old explanation didn't just weaken, it collapsed almost immediately under the very first proper studies. Now, this is actually a pattern that shows up across many areas of biology, not just in the study of dimples. A trait gets observed casually, a simple explanation gets proposed, because it's the easiest one that fits the limited evidence available at the time. And that explanation then gets repeated in classrooms for generations, simply because nobody had the tools to seriously test it. It's only when better technology arrives that scientists can finally go back and check whether the old simplified story actually holds up. In the case of Dimples, it didn't, and the real explanation turned out to be a far more layered and far more interesting story than anyone had originally assumed. Taken together, the full picture that emerged from this research completely rewrites what most of us learned about dimples growing up. They aren't caused by a single dominant gene passed cleanly from parent to child. They aren't a simple yes or no trait you either inherit or don't. They are the visible result of small, complex variations in facial muscle structure, sometimes combined with equally complex variations in jawbone fusion, shaped by dozens of genes working together during early development, and influenced by a fair amount of natural randomness in how the two sides of a developing face form independently of each other. They don't provide any survival advantage. They aren't linked to personality, intelligence, or health. They don't follow the clean family inheritance patterns that old biology textbooks confidently claimed for decades. What they actually represent is something far more interesting than a simple genetic switch, a small, harmless variation in human facial development that most likely stuck around across generations simply because people have always found it charming. The next time you notice someone's dimples appear the moment they smile, you're not looking at a special gene lighting up. You're looking at a tiny structural quirk in a facial muscle, or in some cases the bone beneath the chin, something that formed almost by chance months before that person was even born, shaped by a web of small genetic influences rather than one neat dominant trait. It's a good reminder of something science keeps proving again and again. The traits we think we understand best, the ones we learned as simple facts in school, are often hiding a far more complicated and far more fascinating story underneath the surface. Dimples aren't a switch. They're a quiet, beautiful accident of human development, shaped by muscle, bone, chance, and generations of people simply finding them charming. And now, finally, we actually understand why.